Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make gluten-free noodles. To make the noodle dough, I start off by adding flour. I add 185 grams or 1 1/4 cup of flour. I use Bob Red Mill gluten-free 1-to-1 baking flour, but any all-purpose gluten-free flour would work fine. It does not have to have xanthan gum in it. Next, I add 1 teaspoon of salt and stir this together with a fork. Then I use the back of a measuring cup or a spoon to create a well in the flour. We're going to add our liquid ingredients to this well, so I want to make sure that the flour is packed in pretty tight. I add 2 eggs and 1 tablespoon of olive oil into the well. Then I add in 2 tablespoons of water over the eggs. Now I use a fork to whisk together the eggs, oil, and water. And once I have a really smooth liquid base, I start to gradually pull in flour from around the edges of the well. I try not to fully break the well, but just bring in flour from the top. Once the dough has started to thicken and I have about half of the flour in, then I break the well and pull the rest of the flour. I continue stirring this together with the fork, and then occasionally I'll use the back of the fork to press some of the larger clumps. I'll mention here that I normally use room temperature eggs when I'm doing baking recipes, but in this case I found that room temperature or cold eggs work the same when I'm trying to incorporate them into the dough. So to save time, you can use cold eggs. Once I have most of the flour incorporated into the dough from the bowl, I turn it out onto a work surface so I can start kneading the dough together. At this point, since some of the flour or crumbs aren't fully incorporated into the dough, it should be pretty wet and stick to your hand. But as you continue kneading and as that flour incorporates into the dough, it shouldn't stick to your hand anymore or stick to your mat. If you're finding that it does stick, then add a little bit of flour gradually into the dough. I added about a tablespoon over the dough, and then I rolled the dough in the flour. Once I had some flour all around the edges of the dough, I scooped some of the extras away so that I could incorporate this part first. Then I continued kneading this dough until the flour was mostly incorporated. Once the dough was nice and smooth, it was still sticking to my hand, so I sprinkled more of the flour over the dough and continued kneading. What's really great about gluten-free handmade noodles versus noodles that have gluten in them is that we're really not at risk of making a tough dough. If flour with gluten in it is overworked, it can overdevelop the gluten, which toughens the dough. But in our case, since we don't have any gluten, we can continue kneading and working this dough until it's the consistency that we need. I knead the dough by pushing it out flat with my palm and then folding the dough over on itself before pushing it flat again. Because it can take a little bit of time to make these pasta noodles by hand, I typically start with a wetter dough and then add flour as needed, just to the point that the dough doesn't stick to my hands or stick to the mat. This way I know that the dough won't dry out when I'm working with it later. Now that the dough is the right consistency, I set it to the side and get some plastic wrap. I lightly flour the top and bottom of the dough before putting it in the plastic wrap so that it won't stick. Then I wrap the dough up and put it in the fridge for at least 30 minutes and up to 12 hours. This rest time is critical for gluten-free dough because it allows the flour to absorb the moisture that's in the dough. This means that the noodles won't taste gritty, and it also makes the dough more pliable when we're working it by hand later. After the dough has rested, I set up my workstation with my pasta roller, a little bit of flour, and a little bit of water. Then I cut the dough into 6 equal-sized pieces. I take the first piece and flatten it out and apply a little bit of flour to the top and bottom. This way it won't stick as it goes through the roller. The first piece of dough that I put through the pasta machine is really just a test. I'm testing to see if the dough is still too wet to support itself. If it tears really easy or is sticking to itself, then I need to add more flour. As you can see here, it did tear really easy. I'm also running this through the pasta cutter at the top of the machine. The pasta cutters at the top of the machine are typically really difficult to clean because of all the grooves that are there. So anytime that I run pasta through the top of the machine, I throw away the first bit of dough and really use that dough to collect any dust or bits of pasta that were stuck in that groove. Now the pasta machine is fully clean and I have a better understanding of how much flour I need to add into each piece. I add this extra flour into the next piece that I work with and then press it flat with my hands. I roll it on the thickest setting and then I drop the setting down by 1 and roll it out again. I like a thicker noodle, but if you like a thinner noodle, you can continue rolling this to the desired thickness. Since this is a longer sheet, I cut it in half to make it easier to manage as I put it through the top part of the machine. I roll this through and then put the pasta noodles onto a plate. Then I roll out the second piece and put that onto the plate too. Now I grab the next piece of dough to work with and add flour and then press it flat. I press it flat enough with my hands that it will fit into the pasta machine. If it's too thick when I put it into the pasta machine, it'll actually tear instead of rolling out smooth. As a reminder, I like to start with a wetter pasta dough when I'm making this pasta by hand. I'll add more flour to the first few pieces that I roll out, but as I get to the last couple pieces of dough, I won't need as much flour because it'll naturally start to dry out. If I had added all this flour at the beginning, the last pieces that I work with would be too dry and it would be difficult to roll them out. I find it easier to add flour to the dough and add structure rather than to add water to the dough when it's too dry. However, if the dough does get too dry, or if you add too much flour and need to add more water, it is possible. The best way to do this is to press the dough flat and sprinkle some water over the dough. Then knead the dough until the water is fully incorporated. I find that it takes a lot longer to knead the dough when you're adding water instead of flour, and I also find that there's a higher margin of error. I moved the camera angle here so you can see another shot of how the pasta looks coming through the machine. Again, I'm flouring both sides of the pasta dough to make sure that it doesn't stick in the rollers of the machine. Then I press it flat enough so it's a little bit thicker than the roller space, but not so thick that it tears instead of rolling out smooth. I try not to let the pasta dough sit on the bottom here for too long because sometimes it can stick to itself. That's another reason why it's really great to have flour on both sides of the pasta before rolling it through the machine. I support the pasta dough with my hand spread out while I'm lowering it into the pasta machine. In this case, I split the dough in half since it was pretty long. Then I ran the other half through. When I put the pasta noodles on the plate, I try to spread them out a little bit so they aren't overlapping. If they sit on the plate for too long, they can actually compress on themselves and then they won't loosen up when you boil them to cook. Now that I have all the noodles made, I boil some water on the stove. Then I drop some of the noodles into the boiling water. I'm going to speed this part up so that you can see how the noodles look as they cook in the boiling water. Any noodles that you don't cook off right now, you can store in the fridge for a couple of days. I don't recommend cooking ahead noodles and storing cooked noodles in the fridge because they lose a lot of the good texture and taste pretty mushy. As the noodles cook, they will lighten in color and float to the top of the water. They also start to separate out. I stir occasionally just to encourage that the noodles separate and cook evenly. I cooked these noodles for about 4 to 5 minutes. Once the noodles are done cooking, you can pull them out of the water and top them with any sauce. In this case, I topped them with Swedish meatballs. Alternatively, you can also pull the noodles out of the water about a minute before they're done cooking and finish cooking them off in whatever sauce you're making. This will also help to thicken the sauce. Thanks for watching this video on how to make gluten-free noodles. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.